This is the second webinar as part of a series of webinars organized by Mile in December and January. The first topic we covered about 10 days ago was around understanding key performance indicators. Today we'll talk about selecting KPIs. I was invited to focus on some aspects that relate to the project, the KPI selection project, clarifying how we should go about organizing such a project, and also we'll talk about techniques that can be used as part of such a workshop. I have prepared around 34 slides and we'll go through them together. There are some interesting exercises, some interesting examples, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. Now, since Ali did such a good job presenting myself and the work that I've been doing in this area, I will skip the first slides that relate to the customers that I worked with and the formation that I have in this field. And I will focus on the main topics of today's agenda, looking at the KPI selection project first. We'll talk about stakeholder involvement as part of this, which is a very relevant topic in relation to getting the buy-in for using key performance indicators in organizations. Then we'll focus on selection techniques. We'll look at some of the most popular tools that aggregate KPIs, such as the scorecard, the dashboard, and the healthogram. And then we'll talk about the next steps, which would be the next steps now that you have an initial list of KPIs established. Some of the learning outcomes that are expected to be achieved through these webinars are clarity around KPI selection, how to approach KPI selection, also familiarity with techniques as part of this process, understanding KPI clustering tools and what is KPI clustering all about, and then looking at how KPI selection can be linked to value generation. Because having KPIs in place is only part of the equation of generating value. We also need to use them in the right way for decision making as well as for improvement. All right, well, ready to go. We'll start with looking first at the KPI lifecycle. Now, what I structured on this slide are the main stages of the lifecycle of working with KPIs. The way I see things, the first stage is all about establishing KPIs. Ideally, they should be done through a project, and this is the emphasis of this webinar, how we should go about structuring such a project and selecting KPIs. However, once KPIs are in place, we move into a second stage, which is about maintenance, about usage of these KPIs. And finally, certainly KPIs will change in time. So I call this stage evolution. Some of them will be maintained, some of them refreshed, others will be superseded, and others will be suspended for a period of time and then reactivated later on. What we'll talk about today is mostly the establishment side of things, KPI selection. KPI selection needs to start with needs identification. We need to be clear right from the beginning, what are we trying to achieve? What are we here to do? Why do we need KPIs in place? So as part of that, even as part of the KPI establishment project plan, I consider that the initial step should be communication and stakeholder engagement. This is all about informing staff and management of what is intended to be achieved, consulting relevant stakeholders to understand what are they currently doing in this space in working with KPIs. Maybe they already have some KPIs in use, maybe they already have some good approaches in use. So it's a good idea to consult with such stakeholders, and also to establish an online presence within the organization. I'm talking here about an intranet page or some sort of blog, a way to communicate to colleagues, to stakeholders, what the project is about, who is working on the project, how long will it take, and what is expected to be achieved. Now, this communication and stakeholder engagement phase of the project is something that we should start the project with, but it should also continue on an ongoing basis for the duration of the project until the project finishes. And it's all about ensuring we get buy-in from staff and stakeholders. The next step as part of the project would be KPI selection, and we'll cover this in more detail. To me, there are two main steps to be followed here. One of them is research, doing primary, secondary, internal and external research, and then secondly is having a KPI selection workshop, organizing such a workshop. Following the workshop, in order to understand KPIs properly and to prepare them for activation, for gathering data, we need to document them. So an important step is documentation form completion, and then data gathering arrangements, creating a network of data custodians that have access to data, that submit data on a timely basis in order for reports to be generated. Now, all of this, in a way, is part of going through the steps of selecting KPIs. I do consider that as part of the KPI selection project, we should incorporate not only the selection phase, but also the generation of the first report. So what I listed next as part of the KPI establishment project are the project stages that relate to generating value, in a way testing, doing an initial road test of the KPIs to make sure that they are properly calibrated. So as part of that, we are looking at KPI reporting, gathering the data, generating the report, and also analyzing the data in the report in preparation for the next step, which is about KPI value generation, where this report is analyzed by relevant stakeholders, decision makers, for decision making on one hand, on the other hand for establishing corrective actions, initiative management, and also such reports are useful for results communication, so communicating to other stakeholders, other staff, performance results. And finally, we have KPI maintenance, which is about KPI documentation refresh, updating the log, the history of decisions made in regards to specific KPIs, updating definitions, calculations as needed. Each KPI should have a KPI documentation form in place, which is similar to a patient's, let's say, a file in a hospital, or similar to a student record in a school. So everything we know about a specific KPI needs to be captured in there. So what we have listed on this slide are the major steps to be followed as part of a KPI establishment project. Next, we'll go into more details, especially for the ones in the left-hand column, as they relate, as mentioned previously, to KPI selection. First of all, needs identification. This is all about talking to stakeholders and identifying their expectations first, but also communicating these with other stakeholders, so that everybody is on the same page in terms of why are we implementing KPIs, what are we trying to achieve. During the workshops that I facilitated in the past, some of the most common reasons for using KPIs tended to be grouped within specific clusters. So I developed three main clusters that to me illustrate very well the reasons why many organizations implement KPIs. These are clarity, focus, and improvement. What we have on this slide, there are several statements that express what these keywords are all about in relation to the value added by KPIs. So clarity is all about getting the big picture, processing the data, making sense of this data. And KPIs help us in identifying which bits of the data are the most relevant for decision making and for illustrating the progress we are making in achieving our strategic plans. KPIs are also useful in identifying underperforming business areas, and also they help us with getting a clear picture of our situation. They are also about focus, because once we know how everything looks like, what are the important things to address, we can focus on this. And by focusing, we can also communicate better to staff that these are the areas of importance. And through this, we can achieve alignment and synergy between departments within an organizational context. A keyword also used in relation with KPIs is control. KPIs in a way are about control. Yes, partially KPIs are used for control, for getting a clear idea of what is happening in the organization and fixing what needs to be fixed. But on the other hand, they are also about learning. So I would balance control with learning. We should use KPIs for learning our business a bit better. And finally, improvement. KPIs illustrate what needs to be addressed, but at the same time they illustrate the progress we're making in addressing things that need to be fixed. So they facilitate the process of taking corrective actions. They illustrate whether we were effective in this, and they also illustrate whether or not we achieve productivity increases over time by doing trend analysis. So in general, these are the main areas of value generation through KPIs: clarity, focus, and improvement. Now that we know what we can deliver for the organization, we are ready to take the next step, which is about research. I start my projects, the projects that I'm generally involved in, by doing research. Internal research within the organization, talking to management, talking to staff, getting input from board, either directly or through the documentation that the board submitted to the management in terms of expectations. Research is also looking at historical data, putting together a catalog of research reports that and performance reports that were used in the past by the organization in this area. At the same time, research should focus externally by reviewing what competitors are using, by looking at benchmarking figures relevant to the industry or the functional area, analyzing which are the industry standards in using KPIs, and also analyzing external lists such as smartkpis.com. All of these are meant to help with getting a complete picture from both within the organization and outside of the organization of what the landscape looks like in relation to our KPI selection project. But ultimately, the most important component that ties everything together is the workshop, the KPI Selection Workshop. So the research is an enabler of having a properly organized workshop in place. An example of what such a workshop would consist of is available on this slide, where we have listed the main topics to be covered during such a KPI selection workshop. Generally, such workshops should start with agenda and meeting review scope. So reviewing what is this workshop all about, what are we trying to achieve. Second aspect is around needs review, clarifying the topics that I just mentioned previously. Why are we implementing KPIs? Looking at the terminology and KPI format clarification, which is about understanding what KPIs are, making sure that everybody is on the same page. Next, we are recommending reviewing the process that participants will go through and the tools that they'll be using, the techniques that they'll be using during the workshop. One of the main ones being the value stream analysis. Also conducting such a value stream analysis exercise together with all the participants, and then allowing them to work in groups with specific tasks assigned, for example, working around establishing KPIs for an objective or for a dashboard section. And then finally, aggregating input from participants into a KPI wall of suggestions, reviewing this list based on filtering criteria, making sure the KPIs are relevant, clearly defined, and balanced. Eventually, input from case studies from a list of KPIs that were researched in the past can be offered to generate discussion and to provide additional suggestions around KPIs. And finally, towards the end of the workshop, a list revision of the preliminary KPIs can also take place. A review of the draft list as well as answering questions should conclude the workshop. Clarifying next steps is something that can be achieved either at the end of the workshop or in the email that is sent to participants with workshop notes. Obviously, in terms of workshop notes, some time might take until they are processed, but ideally they should be done within 3 days of the workshop taking place. With the output attached, an email should be sent to participants to invite them to provide additional feedback suggestions on the work that has been done during the workshop itself. What we'll talk about next is what techniques can be used during such a KPI selection workshop. One approach is to start with an expo of KPIs. Some participants may not be familiar with what KPIs are and how they add value, how they actually look like. So there is an opportunity for the organizers of such a workshop to prepare an expo of KPIs. I listed here several examples from smartkpis.com of popular key performance indicators in our database. Such examples can be selected from our database or from other internal materials with existing KPI examples. The purpose of this is just to illustrate to participants how KPIs look like and how they can be eventually clustered. Just to provide an idea at the beginning of the workshop of what is expected to be achieved by the end of the workshop. So such an expo is not about presenting a list that needs to be refined and finalized. The expo has the purpose of just providing context for informed decision making during the workshop. Second, we have the value flow analysis exercise. What I listed here is a screenshot from an exercise that I've done in the past. It's all about selecting an objective and then analyzing what are the value generation stages in relation to that objective. What inputs do we need to put in place and how are we going to measure these inputs? What processes will take place and what metrics illustrate the efficiency, effectiveness of these processes, and finally what outputs will be generated through these transformation processes, and by using outputs, what outcomes do we expect to generate that will reflect the achievement of the objective overall. Now, for clarification, not all these KPIs will be finally used in measuring the objective that they were brainstormed for. What we have here is a list. As mentioned, it's a list that is brainstormed during the workshop with suggestions of what we might want to use in order to measure the achievement of a particular objective. Clustering such suggestions under input, process, output, and outcome helps with understanding what will actually take place in order to achieve that objective. This list needs to be further refined in order to select the most relevant KPIs. And actually some of these suggestions may only be metrics. They may be things that we are measuring but may not necessarily reflect performance, especially the input ones. Ultimately, KPIs are traditionally selected from what we have listed under outcomes, sometimes output, sometimes processes, depending on the nature of the objective. So this is what I call a value flow analysis exercise, or value stream analysis. In understanding how to cluster KPIs under input, process, output, and outcomes, it's useful to take a look at the big picture. And here we have an example from what is called the program logic analysis. It's a variant of the value flow analysis used in the public service for monitoring the achievement of objectives. So the flow is generally all about looking at what inputs do we require in order to achieve objectives, what processes will take place, outputs that will be generated, and by using these outputs, what outcomes will we also generate. Comparing outputs with inputs is all about efficiency. Comparing outcomes with objectives is all about effectiveness. In terms of examples of metrics that would fit under input, process, output, and outcomes, we have here 2 slides of additional information, additional examples of what may fit under these headings. Input indicators are generally about resources that we allocate, financial resources, machinery, as well as talent. Process indicators are generally about time. So as you can see here, we are measuring quite a few things around time, being on time, time to install something. Outputs are about things that we generate as part of processing those inputs. But ultimately, we are not only after outputs. What we want to ensure is that these outputs are used for generating value. For example, building a certain number of miles or kilometers of road doesn't mean that we actually generate value. Because if this road is not going to be used, then the benefits of that project will not be achieved. Similarly, by distributing, let's say, 10,000 brochures or information flyers to a certain population, doesn't mean that we actually achieved outcomes, the outcomes that we wanted to achieve by distributing these flyers. Half of them may end up in the bin. Half of them may not be opened at all. What we want to monitor is what changes occurred in the behavior of these recipients once they received the brochures. This is certainly a bit more difficult to achieve because it takes time, more money, and it's a bit more complicated logistically, but outcomes are what we are generally after, and outputs are just secondary in importance. So this exercise helps in actually understanding the value that we add by deploying a certain objective, and also what transformation takes place from input to outputs and then finally outcomes. It's an exercise that I recommend to be done on an objective by objective basis. The third technique is called KPI wall clustering, and it's all about listing the examples of KPIs identified so far into clusters by objective, or in case they are clustered as part of a dashboard by a relevant grouping. An important step in this is to ensure interactivity as part of the workshop. Ensure that participants talk to each other and are expressing freely ideas, opinions. This helps with buy-in. So working with stakeholders should be something that is built in the KPI selection process. Stakeholders are not there only to be consulted, but they are also there to be involved. So input from clients, suppliers, board members, and employees can be obtained either before or during such workshops by inviting them to certain parts of the KPI selection workshop. Next, the next technique that I want to focus on is called KPI Selection Criteria. So it's about establishing a list of criteria that we'll be using to filter all those examples brainstormed previously. Now, an important criteria is to make sure that they are relevant. And what I mean by this is to make sure that KPIs are reflecting something of importance for the organization. Either the achievement of an objective, either used as part of a scorecard, or a certain aspect of the business that is relevant in decision making. Secondly, they need to be clearly defined. By looking at the KPI name, we should be able to understand what are we trying to measure with that KPI. So KPI should not be generic statements. They should not be expressed as projects. They should not be expressed as objectives. This is something that we covered in the previous webinar, where we talked about the difference between KPIs, objectives, and initiatives. So ensuring that KPIs are succinct and named accordingly should be something to take care of during the KPI selection workshop itself. And finally, balanced. What we need to analyze here is what sort of negative behavior such KPIs, monitoring such KPIs may generate as a result of people trying to achieve these KPIs at the expense of some other aspects of the business. So balancing KPIs is again something to be done during selection by looking at balancing efficiency with effectiveness, balancing quantity with quality, and protecting against gaming. Other popular characteristics mentioned oftentimes in the literature are listed on this slide. However, to me, the most relevant ones are the three characteristics that I listed at the top. We need to ensure that KPIs are relevant, clearly defined, and balanced. Generally, by ticking these three boxes, we protect ourselves against making errors in the KPI selection process. A very important component of workshops is also asking questions. So I have here a selection of performance questions that can be asked during such workshops, clarifying, as mentioned initially, what is in it for me, what are KPIs, looking at what efforts are required for data gathering, what will we do with KPI results. So it's not just about measuring, it's also about generating value from KPIs. A question that I like a lot is what matters. So what matters to customers, especially in terms of working with KPIs. So it's not just about what we can measure, it's also about what is important, what is relevant for the business. And also, in case we select KPIs for company objectives, yes, we need to establish whether or not the KPIs that we have pre-selected actually reflect the achievement of these objectives. We also need to look at what data helps us in making more informed decision making. So this is in the context of using KPIs as part of dashboards. And also at the end of such workshops we can look at whether or not we have the right schedule to maintain momentum. What is next? Clarifying the next steps and how long it will take to complete them. Another technique that I already anticipated as part of KPI selection criteria is balancing KPIs. So what I grouped here are several examples on how we can select KPIs by balancing the initial KPIs identified with another KPI that protects against gaming. For example, for call centers, a very popular KPI is first call resolution rate. This is about ensuring that every time a customer calls, that call is resolved the first time without asking the customer to call again. Well, the danger here is to spend too much time over the phone resolving such problems that customers are faced with. As an option to protect against spending too much time, we can monitor call duration. Now, what happens especially with unexperienced customer service representatives, instead of taking, let's say, 15 minutes in resolving a traditional inquiry from customers, they may spend half an hour, sometimes 45 minutes, trying to make sure they achieve the first call resolution rate. Well, to protect against this happening, what we can do is to ensure that we set up a recommended limit for this, because at some extent they might be better off redirecting the customer or escalating this to level 2 support, So instead of spending half an hour on resolving a call, we could spend 15 minutes, and then by escalating to level 2, another 5 minutes would be spent. In total 20 minutes. This is much better than half an hour. And also it serves the interest of the customer about getting that problem resolved as soon as possible. So the solution here is to balance first call resolution rate with call duration, monitoring the number of minutes it takes to address that inquiry. Other options for balancing in sales and marketing, oftentimes we monitor new customers, market share. Well, certainly we can have new customers and we can increase the market share, but the question is, are we actually making money? Are we still operating with profitable customers? So what we can monitor here is also the quality of our customers. Percentage of profitable customers is a possible KPI, as not all of our customers are profitable. In banking, it's all about balancing the loan value and the loan book, how much money we are lending, with the percentage of such loans that are in arrears with payments, where our customers don't pay back. So it's not just about lending people money, but it's also about ensuring they have the financial resources to pay back. So in summary, balancing is all about looking at quality and quantity aspects, efficiency and effectiveness, as well as anticipating gaming or tunnel behavior, where staff will focus on achieving a specific KPI at the expense of other KPIs. So it's important to anticipate such behavior right from the KPI selection stage and balance KPIs with secondary KPIs. This is why, as part of establishing KPIs for objectives, a good approach is to ensure that we have two KPIs in place so that they can balance with each other. Generally, the number of KPIs that I recommend to be used for each objective is between 1 and 3, but overall 2 is a good number. Now, also in terms of balancing, another example of balancing comes from OH&S, Organizational Health and Safety, where the hierarchy pyramid that was initially published in 1931 is still very much relevant today. It's all about the fact that, especially in the resources industry, let's say coal, mineral mining, oil and gas, a very popular KPI is related to accidents. Same with manufacturing environments. Number of major accidents, number of accidents resulting in fatalities or in hospitalization. Well, in addition to monitoring this, which is at the tip of the pyramid, organizations should also keep an eye on the bottom of the pyramid, which is all about situations of non-compliance with OH&S standards, Organizational Health and Safety standards, which are also called risky behaviors. Because the more of these happen, the more of these take place, the higher the chances of major accidents occurring. So yes, on one hand it's good to monitor what's at the top of the pyramid, but at the other end it's also important to keep an eye on what's at the bottom of the pyramid. Sometimes these two indicators are in the same reporting tool. In other situations we may have the top of the pyramid in the scorecard evaluating the achievement of a certain objective in this area, while the risky behaviors are monitored in a dashboard, an OH&S dashboard, for example. Well, regardless of whether or not they are in the same reporting tool, it's important to ensure that they are both monitored. So that's another example of balancing, where we are interested not just in monitoring things that occurred already. We want to also anticipate the chances of certain results occurring in some of these KPIs from the top of the pyramid by taking action in reducing what's at the bottom of the pyramid. So far we covered KPI selection, but just to anticipate which would be the next steps from the KPI selection workshop, one of them is KPI documentation. And what I have listed in the slide is an example of a KPI documentation form. It's all about clarifying what are we trying to measure, why are we measuring, and how are we going to measure. The definition, the calculation, the sub-metrics used for calculating a specific KPI, the purpose of using the KPI, who are the data custodians, who is the KPI owner. All these examples of metadata are useful to be captured in the KPI description form. An example of such a KPI description or KPI documentation form is listed on the next slide, as used by the Canada Revenue Agency. This is an extract from one of their performance reports, and it illustrates some of the fields used by them. In smartkpis.com we have developed our own templates with about 44 fields and an additional set of probably about 24 fields that we recommend to be used by organizations in an organizational context. So altogether we have over 60 examples of fields that can be used. However, we don't recommend using all of them. They're listed there as options, same as going to the restaurant and having a menu available. It's all about selecting what is relevant in the context in which we operate in. And next, KPI activation. By understanding KPIs, we are also able to figure out how are we going to gather the data, who's going to provide the data, when, from what system. So some useful steps here are establishing a network of data custodians. For each KPI we should have a data custodian nominated, agreeing with them on a target activation date, addressing challenging KPIs, trying to secure budget for activating, gathering data for KPIs that we've never measured in the past. We should also set up activation templates to ensure standardization around data gathering. Reminders can be sent to data custodians to submit the data, peer pressure, and sometimes to avoid such issues altogether with the data custodians submitting data on time, we can look at automating some of these KPIs. In addition to asking data custodians for KPI results, for data for these KPIs, a good practice is to also ask them for input, for comments, to explain what actually happened, to provide context around KPIs. Based on all these components, we can put together a data gathering process with a flow. It's probably a slide difficult to read, but the purpose of this is just to illustrate which are the steps to go through in terms of generating reports, and the importance of having these steps clearly mapped out so that they're well understood by all the parties involved in the data gathering process. And finally, by aggregating all this data, we can generate reports. As part of this, a good step is to ensure we check submissions for accuracy. Next, data needs to be processed. So a good practice is to ask for the raw data and then to put together the percentage calculations ourselves. Doing the data assurance review is also important. In case we see large variances from previous results, we can ask data custodians to double check on data. We can ask them to provide explanation around these large variances. And finally, preparing analysis and commentary around KPI results is also an important part of the report compilation. Finally, everything needs to be aggregated and sent forward to decision makers in preparation for the review of results. Now, this scenario applies to reporting by using a scorecard on a monthly basis. In case KPIs are reported on a daily basis or even live, everything is much more condensed in terms of how long it takes and how it's done. Oftentimes live dashboards are automated, and all these steps are condensed into fewer ones. Regarding reports, what I'll present next are some examples of solutions we have available for aggregating KPI data into reports. Continuing with discussing around OH&S, Organizational Health and Safety. This is an example of performance report that contains a trend analysis year by year. of recordable case frequency for OH&S issues. Just by itself, the way this is presented at the moment, this represents a dashboard. It's a KPI dashboard because we have one indicator analyzed in time with additional discussion around results. In terms of this graph, we have here two examples of tools. One of them is a dashboard of KPIs. So we have in a way the same structure as in the previous slide, but with more KPIs monitored on the same page. So we have a dashboard on the right-hand side, and we have a scorecard on the left-hand side with KPIs grouped under objectives, evaluating the achievement of these objectives. This is another example of a dashboard. Generally, when I start working around building dashboards, I start by putting together clusters in Excel, and then from these clusters in Excel, graphs such as the ones on the right-hand side can be developed. Another example of a dashboard with KPIs relevant to HR and productivity listed. We don't have graphs available here, but at the same time, all these KPIs are not clustered under objectives. So in a way, this is a dashboard of performance results. Another example of a dashboard is this one, developed in Excel, which contains very interesting data visualization options, the microchart and the bullet graph. It's an airline dashboard developed with Excel. Another example of a live dashboard this time is available on two screens. The product used here is called Domo. It's a BI solution with very powerful data visualization functionality. In this case, the dashboard is used live by the Fort Worth Police Department in monitoring traffic accidents, monitoring crime rates. So it's used for decision making. It's not something that is monitored and reported on a monthly basis. It's something that is reported on a daily basis. And finally, the healthogram. This is a new addition to the toolkit of performance architecture tools available to practitioners in working in this space. It contains a variety of KPIs grouped into clusters, and these clusters are grouped into 4 perspectives, following in a way the value flow analysis. So we have resources allocated to teams, we have capabilities that can be monitored through KPIs for each team, we have stakeholders that have to be managed by each team with indicators around stakeholder management, and then finally we have shareholders. So we have a set of KPIs relevant from a financial point of view, which is the interest of shareholders. This is, as mentioned, a new addition in terms of the KPI toolkit, and it is available in more detailed as part of a case study we are using during our courses. In essence, the thinking behind this healthogram is to monitor a specific set of KPIs on a quarterly basis with the purpose of assessing the health of a variety of entities, organizational health, departmental health, even team health. So just from the point of view of how healthy are we in a good shape that positions us well in order to perform as per expectations. Because traditionally performance plans, scorecards, dashboards focus on achieving certain performance results within an organizational context. Oftentimes we forget to also look at how robust our team is and whether or not is appropriately, let's say, resourced but also managed to deliver those performance outcomes that we expect. In a way, it's same as in sports. In order for athletes to perform, they need to be fit. Well, similarly, in order for organizations and teams to perform, they need to be fit as a team, as organizations. Performance scorecards focus on achieving performance outcomes, while this healthogram is about evaluating how fit these entities are. Well, with that, we covered scorecards, keeping track of the achievement of certain objectives, dashboards, and healthograms as options for performance reporting as aggregating tools for KPIs. And finally, let's take a look at the main topics covered today. We looked at the importance of clarifying the role of KPIs right before starting rolling out performance improvement projects, KPI implementation projects. So clarity, focus, and improvement. Next, the importance of understanding the structure of the KPI project. To me, KPIs shouldn't be established as day-to-day activities. They should be established as part of a predefined project with a start date, end date, a coordinator of this entire process, and also with a very structured project plan. Overall, from the moment we initiate such a plan until the moment KPIs are reported on for the first time, I'd say it would take at a minimum 2 months, oftentimes even 3. The reason why it takes so long for such a project to be completed is because the preparation phase takes quite a bit, but also the data gathering, the activation of KPIs will take generally about a month. So at the minimum, we can spend 1 month in initiating the project, taking care of stakeholder communication, research, KPI selection workshops, documentation, and then another month on gathering the data and reporting. In terms of KPI selection techniques, we looked at the KPI Expo, we looked at the KPI wall, the value flow analysis, also balancing technique, and relevant questions, performance questions that can be asked during such workshops. And finally, in terms of getting value from KPIs, selecting KPIs, it's in a way the halfway mark as part of such a project, KPI implementation project. What we need to do next is to document KPIs, activate KPIs, and report on KPIs through tools such as the ones illustrated, scorecards, dashboards, healthograms. Well, with that, I will close off the presentation part of the webinar, and I will pass on the microphone to Ali to facilitate the questions and answers session. Thank you.
Okay, folks, now we are open for question and answer. So if you have a question, you could either raise your hand on the webinar console. There's a hand icon, and I should be able to give you an opportunity to speak to Mr. Aurel Brudan. Or you could equally put your questions in the chat box, and I'll be happy to read them over on your behalf. So feel free to raise your hand for any questions, or post your questions in the chat box. Apparently saying before folks, any questions, you can raise your hand, or you could write your questions in the chat box. While you're writing, let me also, Aurel, take rights as a presenter, because I want to also announce the KPI program, which is coming. Folks, also I would like to quickly announce that there is a program of certified
KPI Professional Training course is going to be held between 13th to 15th January in Riyadh. I've pasted on the chat box the complete announcement, so if you have any questions about it or if you're interested, you can contact our program manager, Mr. Ahmed Mahmoud. So let me go. There are questions. Hands have been raised, so let me try to go first to Kat Davies. Can you carry us? Could you please introduce yourself and...
Hello, I'm Kath Davis. Can you check you can hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Kat. Could you please introduce where are you calling from and your question?
I'm calling from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. My question is there obviously wisdom around how many KPIs is a sensible number? I've worked with organisations that have 30, 40, 50 KPIs, although in fact when I look at them, they're actually filling management information. I just wondered what your thinking was around, really the business be having, as we're saying, they're key performance indicators. Are we looking at having 10, 20, 5? What's the thinking?
Sure, it's a question that I'm oftentimes asked. Now, in terms of KPIs, as in key performance indicators, to me, these days, the term KPI has a variety of meanings to lots of people, and in a way, KPI starts to become a word in itself, same as radar. We all know today that radars are used for navigation purposes. They are used by airlines, they are used by in shipping, they are used by police to catch people speeding. But in terms of what a radar stands for, where does it come from, the acronym in itself comes from radio detection and ranging, and it was a tool invented in 1942 during the Second World War. It's just that over a number of years people forgot the initial meaning of radar, and today we look at radar as a word in itself. Well, similarly, KPIs, yes, they stand for key performance indicators, but today if you talk to someone about KPIs, they will pretty much figure out that they are tools that we use to assess the performance of different entities in certain areas relevant to the business. So this is just an introduction in terms of how I see KPIs. Now, regarding numbers, I would say that in case we are using KPIs for evaluating the achievement of a certain strategy or a certain plan, a good number is to have between 1 and 3 KPIs per objective. Now, the other question is, well, how many objectives should we have? I would say that about 12 objectives is a good number. More than 12, it's a bit difficult to keep track of everything. So a good opportunity for organizations is to make sure that during the strategic planning process, the strategy is well defined in a certain number of objectives that are easy to work with. So if we'll go by this number, let's say around 12 objectives, and about 2 KPIs per each, I would say that about 24 KPIs for organizational or even departmental scorecard would be a good number. Now, certainly this can range from less to more. Sometimes organizations get to about 30 KPIs. I think more than 30 is too much. It's difficult to keep track of everything, and sometimes there are even more opportunities to consolidate further. So I would say 24 is a good number, but generally between 20 and 30 as part of a scorecard. On the other hand, in case we are using KPIs in dashboards, things are a bit different here because dashboards can be clustered in a variety of ways. I've seen dashboards with 1 KPI. I've seen dashboards, as you've probably noticed, the one with the airline with over 20 KPIs in a single dashboard. So with dashboards, yes, we might have again up to about 30, because more than 30 is difficult to group on a single computer screen. But dashboards can be broken down into sections, and then we can have, for example, in HR, we don't necessarily have to look at the HR dashboard overall. We can look at the recruitment dashboard, retention, compensation and benefits, workforce profile, efficiency and effectiveness. So we can have subset dashboards with 5 and 6 KPIs within the major dashboard. Yep, so this would be my answer to the question. 1 to 3 KPIs per objective, about 12 objectives would be a good number.
Okay.
That's excellent. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Kat.
Thank you.
All right, we have more people who've raised hands, so let me move to Mr. Hassan Al-Khayami. The mic is yours, sir. Could you please introduce yourself, where you're calling from, and your question? Mr. Hassan Al-Khayami. Okay, apparently I think we have an audio issue here. So let me move to a third person. Alam Musa, can you hear us?
Hello, this is Alam Musa from Al-Najah University in Palestine. Do you hear me?
Yes, Mr. Musa, we can hear you. Could you please ask your question?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Actually, if we have an institution, then we have the KPIs for the institution, but maybe we have sub-departments belonging to that institution. So how can we link the KPIs for the sub-departments to those of the whole institution? Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the question. Indeed, especially in educational institutions, the challenge is that there's too much data available. There are lots of things that are reported on, and the question is, how do we make all these connections? What makes better sense? Well, from my experience, a useful approach is, first of all, to look at the strategy of that organization. Even universities, educational institutions, K-12 schools, high schools, colleges, they do need to have a business plan in place because they do need to be managed well. So an opportunity here would be to identify the strategy, the business plan for that organization, for that educational institution, which would be developed at organizational level first, and then to cascade down to each department to look at what objectives each department will contribute to, what other objectives are unique to that specific department or even support area. As a result of this, we can also cascade KPIs. So I would start with establishing the strategy for the organization, objectives plus KPIs, and then cascading one level lower at, let's say, core delivery areas, but also support areas, objectives with KPIs cascaded, and then thirdly, cascade even further at employee level, whether admin, support staff, or educational staff, academic staff. Now, this is one approach. On the other hand, there are lots of things that are measured during educational institutions in relation to student performance, attendance. So there are aspects that relate to operations. The solution here would be to develop dashboards where these can be monitored. So we can have an attendance dashboard, we can have a student score dashboards that can be used for information both at operational level and also to help us with making better sense of the data that is available in the scorecard. So operational dashboards complement very well organizational scorecards, as whenever we need to do further root cause analysis, it would be handy to have access to such dashboards to tap into. Yep. So this would be an answer, to combine scorecards with dashboards.
Well, okay. Thank you very much. Let me move to the question box. There have been a couple of questions already posted. From Mr. Hassan Al-Khayami, there are two questions from Mr. Al-Khayami. How can we measure the KPIs away from the personal judgment? That is the first one. The second one is mentioned, since KPIs and objectives has to be driven from organization vision, mission, goal, strategies, what if the board placed wrong input regarding the above? Then the KPIs will be useless and unapplicable?
Right. I'll start with the second question. Indeed, if KPIs are used as part of monitoring the implementation of the strategy, we'll have to start with indeed mission, vision, values, and eventually with objectives. However, KPIs can be also used as part of operational dashboards, as part of SLAs, So there are other contexts in which KPIs can be used. Now coming back to the input from the board, well, certainly this drives the direction, especially at organization level. Usually it's input that is provided in terms of the strategy, the direction in which the organization should go, eventually objectives. It's unusual for such input to be provided all the way to KPI level. Although I did find instances where, for example, KPIs like the Net Promoter Score has been advocated and has been implemented as a result of board members asking for it. Now, regarding this input, certainly it has to be complemented with input from management, because this is what management is there for. Management is not there just to implement the strategy as outlined by the board. They do have to provide their own input in putting into context the guidelines that are cascaded from the board level. So there is an opportunity here to balance the input from the board with input from management and also with input from stakeholders. It's important to consult with clients, consult with suppliers as well, and eventually go back to the board with an updated draft of the strategic plan. So this is all about how the strategic planning process is structured. I think a good practice would be to start with an environmental scan that covers both the external environment but also internal environment. Take this to the board, organize some workshops with the board, and then based on these workshops, based on this guidance, to start off the strategic planning process by organizing management workshops, further workshops with different departments, and then rolling everything up again and then going back to the board with the second draft of the strategic plan. So it's all about having certain loops, feedback loops, and several iterations of a strategic plan before it is finalized. This is how we can protect against going into a wrong direction right from the beginning. Now, nevertheless, there are situations where organizations end up having unoptimized strategies, maybe the wrong strategies in place, measuring them well with good KPIs, but strategies like take them in the wrong direction. Well, recent examples have been Kodak, which filed for bankruptcy in January this year. So certainly they had strategies in place, but obviously not the good ones, since from being a leader in a certain market, they ended up filing for bankruptcy. And also Nokia had its own issues and is currently still in the process of being revitalized as a brand. So yes, there are organizations which can have bad strategies monitored well.
Okay, we can move to the next question from Nicholas Morales. The question is, the KPIs have other KPIs that can help us to identify gaps. How deep the drill down is appropriate?
Well, in terms of drill downs, I would generally look at one level further. For example, percentage process is optimized. It's a very popular KPI in many organizations. Well, in order to calculate the percentage process is optimized, we would need to have access to two metrics. A equals number of processes optimized, B equals number of processes. And then the calculation would be A over B multiplied by 100. So this would be, to me, at the next level. One level further should be sufficient in order to get clarity around how we'll be calculating that KPI. Well, in terms of KPI indexes, I'm not a big fan of KPI indexes. They should be rather exceptions and not the rule. For example, I know that in the beverage manufacturing sector, certain companies use a quality index for the beverage, where certain variables are monitored. The level of sugar in a certain drink, how much carbon dioxide is in it, also the protein level, these sort of things. By monitoring all these variables and aggregating them in an index, we can have a measure that can be used from one sample to another. So this is an example of an index, but it's rather an exception and not the rule. KPIs should be as granular as possible, and the submetrics used for calculation should be sufficient in terms of doing further drill downs.
Okay, thank you. Another one from Brother Muhammad Al-Mahfoud. How would you go about dealing with a poorly defined KPI if you weren't the one who actually defined it?
Well, this is where the KPI Institute helps by providing standards around good practice in using KPIs. So an opportunity would be to consult with our documentation, consult with smartkpis.com, and provide internal stakeholders with substantiated advice, with proof, with data that supports your argument that this KPI can be improved. And certainly having these resources available helps, because that's how we think we can add value, by providing standards, by providing best practice, providing an informed professional opinion around the use of KPIs. There are organizations who still can't distinguish properly between KPIs and projects and initiatives and milestones and even objectives. And as professionals, we shouldn't accept such substandard use of performance tools. One solution that we are offering at the KPI Institute is, besides the resources available, we have a certification program in place where we train and we assess our participants into the use of a KPI management framework in accordance with the standards that we are promoting, with having proper KPI naming standards, going through a structured way of selecting KPIs, documenting and using KPIs. And I think a good solution for organizations is to ensure that they have internally certified KPI professional, alternatively to request their consultants to become certified in the rigorous use of KPIs. At the moment, however, many organizations are still using KPIs as based on ad hoc data and information, and not by using a rigorous approach. And this can affect, in time, the credibility of performance management initiatives in organizations.
So I guess that sort of brings us towards the end of the webinar. I would like to thank Mr. Aurel Brudan on behalf of MILE for your time and willingness to share this valuable information and your experience with our participants. Also, thanks to all of you who participated. We are glad you could join us, and you made it quite an interactive session, and hope it was a helpful session for you. But especially Mr. Aurel Brudan, thank you very much for your time and for conducting this series of webinars too. We will be emailing you the link to a recorded version. We are planning to upload both the previous and this webinar recorded version on our YouTube channel by next week, inshallah, and we shall be emailing you all the link and the soft copy of this presentation as well. Just a quick announcement again, maybe you're seeing it on your screen right now, that the Certified KPI Professional Training course will be held between 13 to 15 January 2013 in Riyadh. Mr. Aurel Brudan will be especially coming to Riyadh to conduct this certified program. And if you're interested to enroll, you can visit www.mile.org/KPI. I have posted the contact details of the program manager, Mr. Ahmed Mahmoud, on the chat box, so you can write to him if you have any questions about the enrollment process or about the program details. Meanwhile, please stay tuned to our website for upcoming programs and the webinars. And with that, I would like to once again thank Aurel for your time, and thank you to everyone who participated, and wish you all a very, very prosperous 2013. Thank you very much.